The contribution a poem's layout makes to its overall meaning is most clearly in evidence in what we call pattern poems, or concrete poems if we are talking about more modern examples. One of the most famous of these poems is Easter Wings by the 17th century English poet and priest GeorgeHerbert. As you can see from the early reproduction of this poem in Herbert's volume The Temple on the left-hand side of the screen, the shape of the two stanzas placed together makes the poem as a whole look like the wings of its title. Rather than being merely decorative, though, the shape of these two stanzas enables the poem as a whole to express its meaning all the more powerfully. This is because the gradual narrowing of the length of each line in the first half of each stanza, followed by the equally gradual widening of the lines again in the second half of each stanza, mirrors first the contraction and then the expansion again of the speaker's own material and spiritual circumstances. Let us look a little more closely now at the poem to see how this works in practice. And we'll begin with the first stanza. Now the argument the speaker is making here is basically this: that in the beginning God created humankind and placed them in a situation of considerable abundance. But as a result of the fall of mankind's original sin and all the sins that have happened since, humankind's situation has become much more reduced, much more confined, much more cut off from God. Nonetheless, it is when we are at this point of absolute reduction, when we have lost everything, that we are much more able then to understand, connect up with Christ, and on this basis, by sharing Christ's sufferings, begin to rebuild once again. Now this, of course, in effect, is the story of Easter, hence the title of the poem, that at the beginning of humankind's existence there was Adam and Eve's fall, their original sin, and Christ came and died in order to redeem humankind of those sins. And then, of course, Christ comes back to life again. So this story of increased suffering and then rising again is the Easter story. And that is what we have enacted in this first stanza. If we just take it line by line, we can see how this functions. Lord, the speaker is addressing God, who createst man in wealth and store. In other words, God, you who created us in a situation of abundance. Though foolishly he lost the same, he here is mankind, decaying more and more till he became most poor. Now in the narrowing of the lines then, we see that humankind's condition has become reduced from one of abundance to one of utter reduction. But then we have a turning point. With thee, set out to be the same length as most poor. This idea that riches can make it difficult for us to understand, accept and live the human message. But when we're most reduced, then we are potentially ready to be receptive to the Christian message. With thee, O let me rise. So the speaker wishes to rise up. And notice we've gone from the general humankind, to the individual speaker. This is individual redemption. With thee, O let me rise, gets longer as he rises up, as larks of birds. Birds also have wings. So again, the meaning and the form of the poem are going together. With thee, O let me rise, as larks harmoniously, and sing this day thy victories. Then shall the fall further the flight in me. It seems to be a paradox in a way, that having fallen, both as humankind in general and as an individual human being, one can nonetheless gain wings and fly once again. So just to reiterate then, this is the message of Easter. And it's a message that the poem enacts. It enacts not just only through what it says, but through the way in which it says it. We feel, we sense, as the lines become narrower, that the situation the speaker is in becomes much more reduced as well. And then we sense the expansion as he finds Christ, he shares his suffering, and is able then to open his wings and fly again. In effect, this is repeated then in the second stanza too, which is much more an individual's story. The one, in a sense, is born into sin and conducts a number of sins, and that makes him become, in his words, most thin. But again, the second half of the stanza starts with the same two words as in the first stanza, with thee. Everything has to be done in harmony with Christ. Let me combine, in other words, let me join up with you and fill this day, remember it's Easter, thy victory over death. For if I imp my wing on thine, imp is an interesting word. It means to graft, like one plant attaching itself to a tree, but it also suggests that the small size of the speaker's wing. Obviously God's wing, Christ's wing, is enormous. We human beings are very small scale, but nonetheless we can attach our wings to those of Christ. For if I imp my wing on thine, affliction shall advance the flight in me. So again we have the same kind of paradox with which we ended the first stanza. The idea that through suffering, through reduction, through the fall, we are reduced to such a state that we are, in a sense, better placed to understand and participate in the Christian message of Easter. That God dies for our sins and enables us to give wing and to rise as Christ rose once again. So the basic point I'd like to reiterate here then is that this is a poem that does not just state its meaning, but very clearly uses its layout to enact its meaning and to make it easier for us, the reader, to experience the same transitions through which the speaker himself goes. Few poems make the correlation between layout and meaning as visually obvious as pattern poems such as Easter Wings, or John Hollander's Swan and Shadow, which you can see on the left-hand side of the screen, to take a more modern example. Nonetheless, this correlation between layout and meaning is always present, and it is something that needs to be taken into account in any analysis of poetry.